Chapter 111. Refit the airships. The crews worked frantically to get the ships refit with the gear-adjusted cannons, which were set on a weighted sled with rollers and blocks. They had to be able to roll back to absorb recoil, then they would be pulled back into place with ropes, and the cranks turned to adjust their aim for the ship's new position. They could adjust both vertically and horizontally, so they weren't as reliant on the perfect positioning of the ship as most cannons. After 2 hours, the techno-wizards finally had an agreement on how they would make the Magitech orbs to create the munitions, and Dominic had a perfect copy of the plan. Now, they just needed to make 3 dozen of the orbs so that they would have enough for both airships, and then a few spares to prove their design to the Royal Auditor, who apparently was supposed to vet all new Magitech designs. They sat down to work, and Dominic took a seat at the end of the table, which confused the specialists. "Advisor, you can wait in your suite for us to finish. We are going to be at least a few hours, even though you have approved the use of all the materials we need." One of the men informed him. "Just pretend that I'm not here. I will make the same thing that you are, and if it works, I will use it as the proof for the audit." Dominic explained. They looked skeptical, but the plans were on the table, and if the royal advisor thought that he could do it, they would trust him. Of course, Dominic's trade skill core was on his bracer, hidden under his sleeve, so they couldn't see that he was an apprentice blacksmith, or they might have been much less accepting of his presence and use of the expensive materials. All of them were either masters or very close to it. A complex Magitech orb was not a project that they would entrust to their apprentices, especially when they were on a time limit. Though the circuits were complex, and there were magical runes involved that Dominic only vaguely understood, though he was familiar with the language, the orb was going together much more smoothly than he had expected. With a final tap of his hammer, Dominic finished his first attempt and pricked his finger on his horn to let a single drop fall on the orb. It was a weird thing that his dad always did when he was making magical items, and he said that it brought good luck to have both your blood and sweat involved in the process. Nobody else noticed the motion. Even the guard thought that he was just running his hand through his hair. But they all noticed when he flooded it with mana and the orb came to life, glowing with magical runes and overlapping lines. Dominic was going to check his skill core to make sure that it worked, but the way that the orb kept glowing, it was fairly safe to assume that it was functional, even if it didn't do quite what he intended. "You're fast. My apologies for doubting you, advisor. Your skills with an engraving tool are peerless." The man on Dominic's left insisted. "That remains to be seen. First, I need to test the orb and make sure that it actually makes a functional cannonball that explodes when we want it to." Dominic joked. That was part of the fun of new magical designs. You never knew if you'd managed to create the desired effect successfully. At least not until you activated them for the first time. The techno-wizard nodded and motioned for Dominic to go away. "You go test. We will finish our work. Just don't set the cannon off. Load it, and then have the crew unload it and check the components." That was way less fun than Dominic had been expecting. But a cannon blast in the courtyard was not going to make any of the craftsmen or the workers happy. Dominic gestured for a loading team to join him. "Advisor, do you think that this is actually going to make a proper cannonball? Not that I doubt your skills, but it's pretty advanced magic." The crewman asked. "I have faith in the experts. I just copied their work, like any other apprentice craftsman would. The shot should be stone, with a cotton wadding, black powder core, and a powder charge behind it. If any of that is out of order or the volumes look wrong, I need to know immediately so that we can adjust the others before they are finalized." Dominic explained. Dominic activated the orb, and the crewman poked a loading rod into the cannon with great trepidation. "Well, I'm not dead, and there is something in there. The depth gauge says that the charge is right. See here, this is for powder only, this for powder plus ball. That's where we're at now. Give me a moment, and I will pull the ball." Dominic wasn't sure how he planned to do that, but the loader had experience. As it turned out, there was a tool designed for just that purpose that grabbed the rough surface of the ball and pulled it up the barrel. Then, the powder was swept out, measured, weighed, and a small portion was detonated to ensure that the powder itself was good. The shot was carefully split and the plug tested. "All good, advisor. We need to test fire a round once all is finished, but all the munitions supply tests show that your orb is good." The crewman informed Dominic with a happy smile. Can it make a solid shot? I'm worried that they might send armored gunships, perhaps with a magical barrier, and explosive shells would have limited effect. One of the other crewmen asked. Dominic shook his head. Unfortunately, there isn't much flexibility in the creation. The timer on the plug was about as much as was feasible, but they're also stone and not solid steel, so they're not going to be great against a durable surface. The primary goal was to make them mana efficient. Some of that will have come at the cost of raw damage output. If they do send armored gunships, aim high and take out the envelope if possible. That is the most likely area to be blocked with a magical barrier, but having cannonballs exploding against their defenses is going to exhaust their crew fairly quickly. How fast could you reload the cannons with that orb? One of the airship captains asked. Me, personally, faster than you can put them back in position. But I am a Wavemates Dragonkin. I wouldn't expect the average crew member to be able to keep that up forever. If you alternate, it shouldn't be an issue, and the actual creation only takes a half-second to focus on the explosion timer. Chapter 112. Airships Aloft. Over the next few minutes, the techno-wizards finished their first round of orbs, and construction was paused so that the practical testing could be done after the charges were examined. The cannons were loaded into the airships and mounted so that the crew could practice their drills with the new equipment, and the techno-wizards split between the two airships so that they could test more efficiently. The ships were otherwise lightly loaded, with just the standard ration load and a few crates of spare parts that were part of the ship's emergency repair kit. Well, there they go. Do you think that it's all going to work smoothly? The Royal Guard asked Dominic as the pair of airships vanished up into the clouds. I have a good feeling about them. The one that I created works perfectly, even if we did have to compromise on the materials. Who knew that making iron was so much more difficult than making stone? The guard laughed. The closer to nature it is, the easier it is to make with magic. Which seems a bit odd to say about techno-magic. But lightning and fire are simple. Wood is only a little harder, and any adventurer will look for a Magitech orb to make firewood. Stone is a bit more difficult, but still not bad. But gunpowder, refined iron, or even a cut instead of an uncut gemstone. All of them take a talented magic user and a lot of skill to get right. Now that Dominic thought about it, the Create Munitions spell that he was issued by the royal family when he was appointed as a royal sorcerer was the most difficult to cast of all of his spells, and that was just to create a handful of pistol rounds at a time. The airships were up above the clouds now, and out of sight. But Dominic hadn't heard any cannon fire yet. They would naturally need to get somewhere that they could point the cannons at a safe spot, but there was a large lake south of Burton, so they might be going there. No, that was over 100 kilometers away. It would take them hours to get there with an airship. Then the clouds flashed with bright yellow light, and the roar of cannon fire echoed over the city. What the hell are they doing? They're right over Burton? Those cannonballs will land in someone's field. One of the keep staff complained. Then a smaller volley of cannon fire responded, followed by another barrage and flashes from a second location. They're not test firing. They've encountered an enemy airship flying above cloud level. Dominic realized. The Royal Guard was quietly counting to himself, and when he got to 15, the first set of cannons fired again, and a large glow marked the demise of the Dago's airship, which was now burning as it fell from the sky with its buoyancy lost and its compartment shredded. Natural suns. Combat positions at the south wall. Someone was shouting, and then pandemonium reigned in the keep as everyone put away their daily tasks and prepared to defend the city. The two Signia airships weren't descending yet, possibly so that they could defend against more Dago's intruders who had hidden in the overcast sky. But the fact that they had made it here, nearly 500 kilometers from the border, without anyone sounding an alarm was not a good sign. The Signia military was not properly set up for defense against air attacks. Well, it's a brilliant proof function, isn't it? There were no actual cannonballs on either ship when they went up, so every shot that they fired was the result of the new Magitech orbs. Now, we can confirm to Her Highness that the plan worked and the money was not wasted. Good work, advisor. Dominic chuckled. It wasn't like he designed the things, he had just given them approval. He should likely make sure that he actually had that authority, but it seemed like something that a royal advisor should be able to approve on their own, even if he had to repay any failures from his own pocket. It's just a shame that we only have 2 ships in our local fleet. If my memory serves, Signia City has 30 ships for their naval blockade of the harbor. Dominic noted. That's on the water. But I suppose that a ship is a ship in some ways. If we had 30 fully armed airships, we could make a cordon over the whole region, the way that the Signia Navy can on the bay. The guard agreed. The first crippled airship had managed to slow their descent by jettisoning cargo overboard, but they were still crashing. Dominic's sharp eyes could see that there were dozens of soldiers on board, and they didn't appear to be paratroopers, or they could have jumped already to give the airship a chance to limp away. As the crippled airship approached the ground, the Natural Sons Regiment began to fire, splintering wood and forcing the soldiers to take cover. Then, more cannon fire erupted overhead, this time in 2 different directions. It looks like we've got a full-scale invasion going on. Dominic sighed. We do now, anyhow. Who knows if they were going to even stop here, if we hadn't shot them out of the sky. One of the platform workers added. Dominic shrugged. Well, as you said, we've got them now. And it looks like we're winning the battle in the sky. I can see 2 more airships coming down, and they're not ours. Perhaps 8 cannons to a broadside is enough to take down the target. We just need more airships. Until the Dago's army realizes that we've weaponized the sky. That logic was hard to argue with. But until they realized what the Signia forces had done to make it possible, they were likely to end up with some horribly inefficient attempts. It wasn't that nobody had ever thought of putting large numbers of cannons on airships before. It was just that nobody had made it worth their time to try. Hopefully, the techno-wizards were holding a magical barrier over their ships to keep them from being taken down by a shot to the flotation envelope. They might have made them fireproof, but they were not cannon-resistant. Chapter 113. Ground Assault. With the Dago's ships knocked out of the sky, their soldiers were preparing to deploy the moment that they reached the ground. But that was what the Natural Sons were here for. The royal guard standing near Dominic watched as the crystal he carried pulsed a dozen times in a pattern of short and long flashes, and then nodded in satisfaction. The princess is headed to the south wall and requests that we meet her there. The airships are in flight now, and they've proven that they are combat effective, so we will be heading to oversee the regiment and the south wall's defense team. He explained. Dominic jogged along beside him as they made their way down the elevated roadways toward the battle. Everything in town had been shut down. There were no vehicles or pedestrians on the road, only men in local police and guard uniforms running in various directions, headed to their duty stations as everyone was called to action. A few minutes later, they were watching the princess get out of an ornate car, which must have escorted her to the edge of the city. The whole Natural Sons Regiment was there, along with a few dozen local guards who were assigned to the crossbow emplacements along the city's defenses. Does the city have cannons? Dominic asked. They're being wheeled out now. They are kept in the towers under guard to prevent tampering and weather damage. One of the city guards informed him. Dominic sighed. They were supposed to be in a state of readiness for an impending battle, not spending 15 minutes rolling out cannons down the wall. Range to the down airship is 810 meters. Dax, the regiment's executive officer, shouted. The nobles adjusted the slide on their rifle sights and began to fire as the soldiers who had survived the early volleys departed the downed and burning airship, looking for cover. There wasn't much to be found, but from 800 meters, the accuracy of the riflemen was mediocre, and the majority of the shots were meters off target. Even with a rifled barrel and predictable construction, the wind and reduced projectile velocity at such an extended distance made it difficult to precisely aim. Hitting stationary targets like the ship was easy. Hitting individual soldiers on the run was not. Where are the cannons? Dominic shouted as the Dago's soldiers began to regroup behind a hedgerow in the distance. Advisor, the first cannons are out, but the munitions carts won't be here until all the cannons are in position. One of the soldiers pleaded. Get crews on the closest cannons. I will load them. Range is 750 meters. Aim for the hedges. Dominic instructed. The cannons were on wooden chassis, with a single screw adjustment at the back. But the crew rapidly got them pulled in position and adjusted, so Dominic could use the Magitech orb to load them. He gestured to the closest 4 cannons, which he had loaded, and gave the order. Fire. Smoke filled the air as the cannons fired, and a set of explosions threw dirt in the air in the fields near the hedges, while the crews swabbed the barrels and pulled the cannons back into position. Now, there were 8 cannons along this section of wall in place, so Dominic loaded them all and gestured to the crews, so they knew they were included. Fire. Again, explosions tore up the fields, but this time one hit the hedges and halted the approach of the soldiers who had been headed for that location. Princess Alexis came to stand beside Dominic as he reloaded the cannons and let the wall commander give the orders. The next 2 airships are coming down near the same location. It looks like they're planning to regroup, she explained. Dominic nodded. The natural sons are doing well, and now that the city finally has their cannons in place, they should not have any problems keeping the enemy out of siege range. 3 airships will not be all of it. It's all but guaranteed that they will have sent dozens for an attack on a major city. But our airship captains report no more Dago's vessels on the horizon. If we drive the enemy back to their ships, it will force the reinforcements to start from much further away than they had planned. Princess Alexis informed him. Dominic took out his map of the area and traced the lines of the topography with his finger. The intercepted and downed airships landed on the south side of the city, but it should be safe to assume that the army will be arriving either from the north or the northwest. They were last reported at Staptentave, and we don't have a location update after that. Princess Alexis sighed. That was 600 kilometers northwest. Even for the finest of off-road vehicles, it was a hard day's drive. If they were coming down the road, they would have already encountered the standing army, under the command of one of the princes, who were ordered to hold the river crossing and the road to Castle City, which was a much closer target than Burton. Commander, they're digging in. They've got foxholes dug in the back of the hedges. Shall we continue to fire? One of the artillery observers asked. As long as the advisor continues to load your cannons, you continue to fire. If we can't make them bugger off, we can sure as Sunday make them wish they had. The commander ordered. Dominic chuckled softly as he reloaded the whole wall worth of cannons. It was only 12 cannons, but the end emplacements were hundreds of meters away. The city hadn't been upgraded as a defensible fortress in quite some time, and it was intended to rely mostly on archers and crossbowmen to hold the wall, not cannon fire. How long can you keep that up? Princess Alexis asked Dominic as he raised his hand again to signal that the cannons were loaded. Probably another hour. By then, all the defenders on this shift should have arrived, and the cannons will have their full supply of shot and powder in place for the next charge. The princess patted him on the shoulder. Don't work yourself too hard. You're a royal strategy advisor, not an artillery officer. Chapter 114. The waiting is the worst. The natural sons continued to fire, picking off as many soldiers from the final 2 crashed airships as possible, and making it impossible for the Dago's soldiers to relocate most of their supplies before the airships burned. That would make it hard for them to hold out for any extended period of time, especially as they were going to be bombarded for another half hour or more before Dominic relented. Normally, the wall cannons wouldn't fire for such a small group of enemy soldiers, but when the ammunition was free and the royal advisor was providing it, they weren't going to complain about a nice long live fire drill to shake the rust off everyone's skills. For half an hour, Dominic continued to reload the cannons as the princess watched the progression of the cannon teams. That's enough. They're just going to wear themselves out for their next shift if they keep it up at that pace. She finally ordered. The guns fell silent, and the riflemen followed suit, settling in for dinner against the crenellations of the wall. That way they could be on location if something happened, and a short run along the wall to anywhere else that they might be needed over the course of the evening. The standard rotation would split the regiment into thirds, with one group on duty, one eating and doing maintenance, and one sleeping at any given time. That way, they could call up 2/3 of the regiment in under a minute, and they would rotate off the wall every few hours, except in the most dire of situations. There weren't enough of them to cover the whole wall, but there were thousands of city guard archers who could take up their positions. Princess Alexis gestured for Dominic to get in the car with her, and the driver took them back to the keep. Well, we've made progress today. Your initiative to switch the airships to Magitech munitions was a resounding success, and after conferring with the Royal Council, they have approved 2 techno-wizards or equivalently equipped magicians to be deployed aboard every trip. Now, the actual design of the Magitech orbs will have to be sent back in person, but by morning, I am certain that the Mage Academy will be sending someone here to collect it before anything can happen to it. Tell me, how did you come up with the idea? She asked as they drove. Dominic chuckled. I'm not even sure that I did. The ships didn't have enough carrying capacity for what the techno-wizards planned to add to their armaments, so I gave them advice on what needed to happen to make their plan viable, and then everyone started working on a new Magitech orb and a modified cannon carrier. Alexis laughed. Well, they forwarded it all as your initiative, presumably, so that you would take the fall if it didn't work. But now that it has worked, you get all the credit. Good thing that I kept a spare copy of the Magitech orb. But tell me, they said that it would have to undergo review by a royal auditor or something. Should I make another orb for that? Dominic asked. Both the princess and the driver laughed a little at his question. You are the royal auditor. Any advisor appointed by the royal family is qualified to hold an audit of resource use for military purposes. What you need to do is make up the report about the event, informing the king and council how it was done, and that all went well. Alexis replied. The driver stopped at the main entrance to the keep, and Dominic couldn't help but notice that the blood stain from earlier had been immaculately cleaned, but it had left a portion of the driveway cleaner than the rest, which was currently being remedied by staff with stiff bristled brooms and soapy water. Well, it looks like we're in for the invasion that everyone feared we would get. Alexis muttered as they walked inside. We've got a good group here, even if the city is a fire hazard on a good day. Did you have a particular plan in mind for when the enemy arrives, or do we come up with something once they are spotted? Dominic replied. We will work it out in the morning. Sleep early, because I expect that we're going to have visitors in the morning, intending to recover their downed airships. There are bound to be plenty of valuable resources on them, and it won't be possible to recover them in the dark. Besides, if the Dago's army isn't here in the morning, we will send a sortie out to loot them dry. Our airships should be landing soon to prepare a full crew for tonight's defense. That will include multiple techno-wizards, but not all of them. There are a number of accomplished witches and arcanists in the city that can also fill the role, so they will be paired with one of the techno-wizards to crew the airship. I discussed it with the Marquis while you were on your way to the wall. Alexis explained. Dominic nodded. I will be in the tower, but this time I'm keeping a barrier cast over the room. They're not likely to try to poison me with the one toxin I'm immune to twice in a row. The princess laughed gently. There will be a pair of guards stationed at your door tonight, along with the maid, who should have your dinner ready. We were originally going to all eat with the Marquis and his family, but now that the battle has officially started, he has far too much to do. We are largely figureheads here, just around to give orders and approve plans. But once you've eaten breakfast, come straight here. Dominic nodded. All right. I will see you first thing in the morning. Is there anything else that you need before I go? Alexis shook her head, but Dominic could see that she was nervous. Not that he wasn't or that it was unreasonable. They had started the day with an assassination attempt, and then followed it up with an invasion by airship. All in all, it was making a run for the worst days of the year list. Chapter 115. Night Guard. Dominic made his way through the halls to the tower and up the stairs, where he found that the same maid was on duty, looking somewhat exhausted and flustered. In the hall before the doors to their respective rooms, 2 guards were keeping watch, though Dominic used the word guards loosely. Both men were well past their middle years, and one looked like he had been pulled out of retirement for this duty. But he had the sun-worn face of someone who spent a lot of time outside, and his pistol was hung in a well-worn holster on his hip. Dominic couldn't see a trade skill core on him, but that didn't mean he didn't own one. Or even that he wouldn't be formidable with a pistol without one. Royal Advisor, we have been assigned night guard duty for your suite. The old man greeted him. Thank you for your sacrifice. I was never a fan of night shifts. The guard nodded in acknowledgement of the comment and returned to carving something from wood with a pocket knife, though he was also watching the staircase, and the hand holding the stick was right next to his revolver. Dominic stepped into his room and saw that the window had been broken. The room smelled faintly of some chemical he couldn't name, but the room had been aired out to some extent before the window had been boarded over. "I'm sorry that it's so dark in here. We were unable to get a glazier up here to replace the window today. I believe that the princess has requested that the tower be reinforced for tomorrow night." The maid informed Dominic softly as she came in with his food. She made a sign of warding over her chest as she took out the poison tester's spoons, and Dominic cast quality kibble again, just in case. "Did you cast a spell on the food? Is it poisoned?" she asked quietly. Dominic shrugged. "The spell is supposed to cleanse toxins and rot from food. But as we learned this morning, it doesn't work if the poison doesn't affect me personally, which is fine in most situations. But you're the one that gets to find out if there were any toxins that I am immune to." "I am asking for a raise after this assignment," she muttered. The dinner was simple, just stew and buttered bread. That made it easy enough to test, and it was the same thing that she had eaten in the servants' kitchen earlier on her own dinner break. Why the royal advisor was getting the same thing as the servants of the Marquis keep was a mystery to her, but Dominic didn't seem to mind. At least she knew that it wasn't likely to be poisoned. Dominic woke to the sound of blaring alarms and the rhythmic thump of airship blades spinning up to speed as the vessel prepared to move. It wasn't even bright out yet, but Dominic could hear movement in the hall as he got dressed and put on his armor with his better robes. If they were going to have a full battle today, he was going to look good doing it. Dominic activated mage armor, so he had a layer of protection in case of issues, but when he opened the door, he found that the same guards were still present, and a very sleepy-looking maid had just been roused to find them all breakfast. The only major issue was that the tower was nowhere near the kitchens, and Dominic didn't have time to wait. "Don't worry about me. I will eat once I get to work. But grab 4 servings anyhow, so anyone who might be watching believes that I'm taking my time getting ready this morning," Dominic instructed. He followed the maid down the stairs, and when she turned to go to the kitchens, Dominic moved as silently as he could down a side hallway, headed for the section of the palace where the princess was staying. The royal guard was on full alert and expecting his arrival when Dominic made it to their hallway. Colonel Wilkes, who had his helmet off to distinguish himself from the other royal guards, motioned for him to join them. "The princess still needs a few minutes to get ready. I believe she has been sending messages back to the Royal Council for their war strategy meeting of the morning. We've got food ready, prepared ourselves, so we know that it's safe," the colonel explained. "Good call. I had the maid go get food for everyone who is in the tower, myself included. But my portion will either sit on the desk, or someone will get brave enough to eat it." They ate in silence, waiting for the princess to be ready. When she eventually called them in, Princess Alexis looked pale and troubled, as if already regretting volunteering for this particular posting. "What is the news of the morning? I hear the airships preparing to go above, so we must have an invasion force incoming." Dominic greeted her. Alexis nodded. "Indeed. We have an entire army coming our way, but not from Staptentave. That force is still right where it was. What we have detected is a wing of 10 Dago's airships, each equipped with a pair of cannons per side, and an entire mechanized infantry army. They came directly from the north, somehow bypassing our border security. But the nobles whose lands they passed through overnight reported nearly 1,000 vehicles pulling trailers loaded with soldiers and equipment." Dominic did quick mental math. 50 soldiers per truck seemed like the logical maximum, and half the trucks would be reserved for supplies if they were planning to be here more than a few days. So, 25,000 soldiers. That was a considerable number, but for the siege of a walled city, it wasn't unreasonable. It was close to the total population of Burton and 5 times the number of soldiers they could field, even with conscription, but it was unknown if the Dago's army had sufficient levels of techno-magic to breach the walls. Chapter 116. Aerial Superiority. The first concern is whether the 2 airships that we outfitted last night will be enough to hold the line and prevent the city from being bombed. Military intelligence suggests that they intend to fly over the city and drop explosives on us. Princess Alexis continued. It wasn't a bad plan, Dominic had to admit. He had been planning to do the same thing to them. There are 10 more airships on the way here to be retrofitted. They have the cannons and a magician on crew. They just need the Magitech orbs. Advisor Dominic, I will ask that you prepare for that. Colonel Wilkes, I need you to oversee the wall defense efforts, in coordination with Commander Dax and General Merlot of the Natural Sons. I will be in meetings with Marquis Burton all morning, in the command room on the top floor of the keep. When you need me, come directly there. Both of you will have one guard assigned to shadow you for safety, no questioning that decision, and no sending them on errands. Dominic smiled at her insistence. That reprimand was certainly not for him, but for Colonel Wilkes, who oversaw the princess' personal guard. He did not look happy about it, but it was better to move in pairs when you needed things done, and there were 7 more members of the royal guard assigned to Princess Alexis and her safety. Did we get all the answers we need out of yesterday's captured assassin? Or has that been postponed given recent events? Dominic asked. We got all that we need. He is being held beneath the keep for the moment. Now we all need to be off. Marquis Burton isn't a military man, and he needs assistance. Dominic and Colonel Wilkes nodded, then exited the room with a guard right behind them. Dominic found the majority of the techno-wizards just where he expected, sitting in a room beside the guest dorms at the airship docks. Gentlemen, on royal orders, we have work to do. There are 10 more airships coming in, all equipped to match the 2 currently in the air. All they're missing is the Magitech orb and a techno-wizard to show their magician how to use it properly. 10 new airships is our minimum for the day. That's 1 new orb created by each of the experts here. If we can make more before they arrive, that's even better, and they can be handed off along with the duty to operate them to the next airship wing to arrive after this one. Dominic explained. The group of eccentric magic users all laughed and lifted various optical devices and magical goggles from their faces. We're way ahead of you, Advisor. We've got 20 of them made already. 24 if you count the 4 extras that went up with the men in the defense ships. We thought that it might be good for every magic user to have one, just in case of injury or damage. If you're going to make an extra, now is the time. We will try to make another batch before the airships arrive, just in case we can get a 3rd mage on board to increase our firing rate if we get surrounded. One of the techno-wizards, a man with shockingly green eyes, explained. Well, that makes my life easier. I will stay here while we make 1 more round of Magitech orbs, and then I will return to the Marquis and the Princess to update them on your progress. The green-eyed magic user laughed. Let me ask you something if you can answer honestly, Advisor. Who was it that requested you have us make more Magitech orbs than we need? The Princess or the Marquis? Dominic shrugged. Princess Alexis. I don't believe that she has conferred with the Marquis yet this morning, but I wasn't privy to any meetings they might have had later last night. The techno-wizards all laughed, as did the royal guard assigned to Dominic. I take it there were no meetings? Dominic asked. Marquis Burton retreated to his safe room with his wife for the evening just before the sun went down. The royal guard clarified. The techno-wizards had to try not to laugh. It was standard procedure, as there had been an assassination attempt earlier in the day, but it was the ranking noble who should have been moved to the safe room. That would be the princess, not the Marquis and his wife. Dominic knew that much from his crash course in etiquette. That course was becoming much more relevant by the day, he noticed. It had seemed like such an esoteric training course at the time, but now, he couldn't even rule out someone actually challenging the princess to a formal duel. His mind was distracted as Dominic sat down to start work on another Magitech orb of self-loading cannon rounds, as the techno-wizards were calling it. But everyone was doing the same thing, working from the same pattern, and it built a sense of familiarity and camaraderie among the small group of magic users. They were most of the way finished when the sound of approaching airships had the ground crews running about, preparing to resupply the new arrivals. The platforms were meant for a maximum of 4 airships at a time, so either they had to get the techno-wizards and supplies on board quickly so they could cycle them through, or find a way to platoon the airships together to pass supplies to the far end. Storage devices had limited capacities, and the airships needed to carry large supplies of shelf-stable food and water, plus repair supplies, fuel for the propellers, and anything else they were short on. The first to finish are the first to head out. Leave your last creation here with me, and I will pass them to the next group along with instructions. Dominic ordered. Of course, Advisor. No offense, but when things start to get hairy, we'd all rather be on an airship than in the city under siege. The green-eyed man joked. At least that way, there will only be 1 or 2 people shooting cannons at you at a time, and not an entire mechanized field army. Dominic replied, getting a dark chuckle from the others as they finished their work. Chapter 117. Send them aloft. A younger techno-wizard was the first to rise and hand Dominic a glowing Magitech orb. Good luck with the defense of the city. As we hear, you're going to need it. Then, one after another, the rest finished their work and joined the crowds headed for the airships. You know that the Marquis is going to be pissed that you let all the techno-mages leave, right? The Royal Guard asked once they were alone. I have the blueprint for the Magitech orbs, I have the extra supplies, and they will come back when their shift is over. The schedule is on the wall. 12 hours they're supposed to be in the air before returning. Dominic replied. I think that he will be more upset that they're going into battle, and they won't be here for him to blame when he can't come up with some harebrained idea about how to use magic to get his city defense plans to work. In the corner of the room, a radio crackled, giving them an update on the situation outside. Ships 5 through 8 are off the ground. Ships 9 and 10 land and prepare to be supplied. Defense cordon vessels have engaged the Dago's fleet from superior altitude, preparing to fire. Only a few seconds later, cannon fire could be heard from the distance, at least 4 volleys, and possibly 6. In the overcast of the day, it was impossible to tell if any of the Dago's ships had returned fire, but the radio reports were positive. 4 enemy vessels, losing altitude fast. 1 is burning up. That was half the Dago's vessels that they had detected coming for the city, lost in a single volley. Dago's vehicle force is within sight of the northern walls. All ground force orders are now going radio silent. The last of the Magitech orbs were finished, and the airships were beginning to leave the platform. However, the battle overhead was becoming more intense by the minute, suggesting to Dominic that there were far more than just 10 enemy airships in the vicinity. All right, I have done what I can here, and all the techno-wizards are in the air with their vessels. Let's go relay the message to the princess. Dominic informed his shadow from the Royal Guard. They quickly made their way through the keep to the strategy room on the top floor, and Dominic nodded a polite greeting at the people inside before moving to the window to get a first-hand visual of the situation to the north. And quickly realized that was a mistake. He was happier not knowing. Well, it looks like Dago's hasn't been slacking on their military forces. I see that they've mounted catapults to trucks as well. Not particularly high-tech, but if they're drawing them with a hydraulic winch, they could be brutally efficient. He noted. Princess Valexa sighed. I just got the Marquis to calm down. Did you have to bring up more bad news? Dominic shrugged. I don't think that it will be too bad. Mobile catapults still need to stop to fire, so it's no different from the strategy for any other set of siege weapons. The techno-wizards got a head start on the day, and I have a whole set of Magitech orbs available now if we're getting more airships, or have mages to keep the wall cannon stocked. The aging Marquis huffed in annoyance, then gestured to a map on his desk. We do have nearly 100 certified mages in the city's defense force. A few per shift move to the wall to feed cannons doesn't seem excessive. We have 8 squads of 3 already set for wall duty. If they start out loading cannons until the enemy is closer to the city, it should allow us to stretch our stockpile. He announced. And where will the rest be? Dominic asked. Either on fire prevention or resting until the walls are challenged. The Marquis then pulled a cord that rang a bell, and a boy in a uniform with the Marquis crest on the jacket entered. Call up one of the Mage Corps officers. We have new equipment for them before they go to the wall. He ordered. The boy took off running, and Dominic sat in silence for a few minutes before a middle-aged man in mage robes jogged in. Sir, you said you have equipment for us? Dominic took out 8 of the Magitech orbs and handed them over. Split those between the force on wall duty. It's preferable that you use them in bonded, but if you want to attune one and level it up, you can apologize to the techno-mages later. Dominic informed him. The mage smiled as Dominic continued. They're for automatically loading cannons. Explosive shot, and you can set the timer as you activate the orb. It defaults to maximum time, and the balls are stone, not metal, so they're better for fragmentation than bowling through enemy forces. Oh, that will work wonderfully. Keeping enough powder and shot for the later days of a battle is never easy. Thank you, Lord Sorcerer. How is the battle going overhead? Dominic looked to the princess and the Marquis, who should have the most news, as there was a radio in the room. 12 confirmed kills so far, with none of our airships lost. The Dago's ships are loaded so heavily that they're struggling to gain altitude, and we've been able to fire down at them from over a kilometer away. They haven't been able to return fire effectively, so our damages have been light. The mage nodded and then rushed out of the room with the 8 orbs. Was that the whole supply? Princess Alexis asked. Dominic shook his head. No, I have a few more in case we get more airships. We sent 2 per airship this morning, in case one was damaged or lost overboard. They're only carrying a token amount of actual powder and shot, so without the orbs, they would be in trouble nearly instantly. The Marquis nodded and then frowned. We considered trying to evacuate the city, but it's been built so densely that the operation would prove impossible. The gates have been sealed and blockaded, and the walls are thick, designed for an extended siege. But I don't know how long the city can hold against a modern force. He explained. Princess Alexis smiled and patted him on the shoulder. Well, once they've dealt with the airships, we've got nearly 100 more cannons in the air to be turned on the Dago's force. Chapter 118. Mechanized Assault Force. Half an hour later, the first cannons began firing on the north wall. The enemy force had moved within cannon range, preparing to set up their siege weapons while the troop transports were still racing toward the city, intent on using a mechanized charge to try to get the advantage of a shock assault. It took time to redeploy troops who had to run across the city on foot, but the entire Natural Sons regiment was already in place, and once the Dago's army started getting close, gunfire joined the sound of cannons from the wall, and the whole north side of the city slowly vanished into a white haze of gun smoke. The firing rate wasn't slowing, and the smoke was getting thicker. But the flagmen were relaying messages to the interpreter in the window, who was making notes for the nobles and the advisors in the room. They're nearly at the wall now. The riflemen targeted drivers as much as possible, but there wasn't enough warning of the invasion to get more than the basic defenses erected around the city. Marquis Burton lamented. That meant the moat, which was surrounded by a ditch, which had been oiled, in preparation for being set alight, and the simple fence of spiked poles dug into the leading edge of the bulwark in front of it. Those should stop the trucks effectively enough, preventing any tactic that involved ramming the walls or directly flipping up siege ladders. It wasn't optimal, but when the soldiers unloaded, they would be vulnerable to the defenders on the walls, as the fortification had been set with an archer's accurate range in mind. The enemy has auto-loading crossbows. The interpreter relayed, not entirely certain he had read the signal correctly. That did sound like it could be an issue. Rate of fire was the great downfall of crossbows, so if they could fix that, their effectiveness could be close to that of a rifleman. The man at the window shrieked in fear, and Dominic froze for a moment, wondering what was going on. Then, he activated an area barrier over the north side of the keep, just in time for a massive stone to crash into it. Then another and another. The booming of stone shattering against the barrier shook the air inside the keep, and Dominic focused on keeping the barrier active. The spell was in his book, along with a few others that he knew, so it was at level 7 right now, which was enough to call it proficient, but he had never actually needed to test it before. Channeling mana to bring the barrier up to full strength wasn't too draining. But Dominic's brief training in noble etiquette had reminded him that the bombardment could continue for days before all the good stones were depleted. Some of the stones were missing their mark and landing in the city, others crashed against the outer city walls, lobbed by weapons set further back, out of range of the cannons. A mage ran into the room, holding a staff with a large golden gem at the top. Oh, good. Someone has a barrier up already. I will trade you. He nearly shouted, adrenaline fueling his actions as he placed a secondary layer of barrier behind Dominic's. That works for me. I will leave that one up. At least until the stones break it. That should buy you at least a few minutes to catch your breath. Dominic agreed. The mage nodded. What level of area barrier did you use? Level 7. That should be enough for now, I hope. The mage's relief set Marquis Burton at ease. The standard for their magical troops was level 5 on the major combat gems. So, while most of them were at or above the level that Dominic had set, none of them should be significantly below it, which meant that their location was safe.
For now.
That didn't stop the bombardment. Neither side cared that there were techno-mages present, blocking much of their weapons' fire. Much more of it on the Signia side, but that was largely due to the difference in armaments. The Dago's army was using rapid-fire crossbows to return fire at the soldiers on the walls, but the city's mage units also had magical barriers up, and the crossbows were firing mundane arrows. From what Dominic could gather from the messages, it looked like the Dago's army had gotten enough stolen knowledge to upgrade the weapons in time, but they hadn't understood that it was necessary, or hadn't had the manpower to do all of the ammunition as well. That was a direct contrast to the Natural Sons Regiment, whose high-powered Magitech rifles were regularly punching through weak spots in the Dago's barrier, and the front lines of the assault had lost multiple mages already. It was impossible to tell just how the battle was going, or even get a feel for the intensity of the struggle at the walls, through the cloud of white smoke. But the repetitive cannon fire and the crashing of stones against stone walls and barriers was enough to know that it wasn't slowing down. Then, a pair of Signia airships descended from the clouds. Not falling, but a controlled descent which put them in position to bombard the siege weapons of the Dago's mechanized army. Though 16 cannons was not a significant force, fewer than a tenth of what the Dago's army was preparing to move forward into firing range, attacking from above, let them fire from well out of range of any sort of return fire that Dago's force could muster. The cannonballs exploded all through the back lines with the reserves and the artillery, destroying vehicles, shredding cannon support frames and reservist bodies alike. That much Dominic could see from the window of the keep's top floor. Why are they not sending more down? They're magnificently deadly. Marquis Burton cheered. Because their primary advantage is altitude. If they are ambushed from above by the Dago's fleet while they attack the ground force, they will be shot down behind enemy lines. While their bravery is saving many lives on the walls right now, it could cost them everything if they're caught. Princess Alexis explained. The Marquis took a deep breath and nodded. Aerial combat came with a whole new set of concerns he had never been trained for. Chapter 119. Strafing Runs. The bombardment continued for most of an hour before the ships suddenly broke and began motoring south as fast as possible, while gaining altitude. The fleet must have encountered more Dago's airships, and they were trying to get behind the other defenders before the enemy arrived, so they would have time to get back into position. The damage done to the defenders had effectively crippled their artillery, and the stones were only hitting the keep's barrier a few times a minute now. They were still targeting the wall, and the battle was still ongoing, with constant cannon and archer fire. But without the ability to take down a section of wall, they would have to attempt to breach with infantry. It was possible. In fact, it was how most fortified cities fell. But it was brutal and bloody on both sides, and the death toll would be horrific. Dominic waited for more reports from the wall, as the last one they had received was wall holding, ramparts holding. That was unexpected, but with the rapid firing of hundreds of rifles, they must have managed to keep the Dago's soldiers from crossing the moat and pressing the wall, where the defenders would have to lean out to fire at them. That exposed them to the archers, but it was the only way to keep them from erecting scaling ladders unless you had another defensive measure. Dominic wasn't aware, but the mages of Burton's city guard did have such a plan. They had learned a spell to create boiling oil, and they could cast it over the wall without ever exposing themselves to enemy archers. If the boiling oil didn't do the trick, they could simply toss a lit torch behind it, and the resulting flames certainly would drive any enemy away from the wall. The problem was that the number of mages was limited, and once you had used a technique more than once, the enemy would adapt their strategy. On and on, the gunfire and booming cannons echoed over the city, until finally, late into the afternoon, a horn sounded from the Dago's lines and the infantry began to retreat, leaving their crippled transports to serve as cover for their next assault. Bodies littered the ground outside the fortifications, and as the smoke cleared, Dominic could see the deadly toll that the explosive cannon rounds had reaped on the infantry near the wall. The stone cannonballs were patterned on the inside, and the outer shell shattered into marble-sized fragments that had absolutely shredded the armor of the Dago's infantry. Dominic examined the damage, then wondered if a ceramic shell might be better. Hardened clay wouldn't be, any more difficult to make than stone was. But for now, it was functional enough, and the blast patterns appeared to be lethal for nearly 15 meters. There would be many injuries further from the blast than that, but only where the fragments managed to hit somewhere unarmored. Then, a half hour after the retreat, a group of soldiers with white stripes on their helmets approached the wall. Dominic wasn't familiar with the marking, but those should be the mortuary forces. It was a polite way to say scavengers, but their duty was to recover bodies and possible survivors. There was a long-standing custom that they came unarmed and only took the bodies, leaving any fallen weapons where they were, so they wouldn't be mistaken as a night raid. They also weren't attacked by the defenders as they did their somber work. "Aren't the airships scheduled to come down and switch shifts soon?" Dominic asked as the sun fell beneath the horizon and full darkness set over the blacked-out city. If they were going to land tonight, they wouldn't have much of a visual reference to go by. Princess Alexis shook her head. No, they have enough fuel and food for 2 weeks, as long as they're conserving when they're not in combat. The crew that is up there was ordered to get some sleep and keep someone on watch for the night flights of the Dago's fleet. We don't have enough trained men to swap them out, and descending puts them at greater risk of attack, so it's safer if they just float up there. Dominic nodded. You should get some sleep as well. I might only be vaguely familiar with the standards for a siege, but I do expect that there will be a night raid of some sort, attempting to get over the wall and cause chaos. Princess Alexis nodded. There are cots in the side room. Bring them out, would you? It wouldn't do for any of us to be unavailable when the messages start coming in. Later in the siege, we can return to our own suites, but for tonight, it is best to be right here in the command room. Dominic got up and pulled the 3 folding cots out of the storage room, then wondered how he was supposed to set them up in the room. Just 2 is fine. Marquis Burton has a room on this floor, just down the hall from us, which is still protected by the barrier, she explained. Dominic nodded. That made sense. Of course the Marquis would have a safe room next to the strategy room. That did mean that they would be sleeping in their armor, expecting a night raid, but that wasn't too big of a deal to Dominic. He had slept outdoors more nights than he could count, with or without blankets. Sleeping on a lumpy cot with his armor on wasn't the worst conditions he had ever faced. They even had a fire going to keep off the evening chill. Dominic got everything set up for the evening, and the Royal Guard rotated shifts for the overnight hours, while the princess moved off to the storage room to change for the evening. While it might be more conventional to sleep in your armor during an extended battle, you can go ahead and change to sleep. We're not frontline forces for this one, so there is time to put it back on if we see trouble coming, she explained. Then she held up a Magitech orb, and Dominic laughed. She had a clothing orb for her armor, and the modest dress she chose as night clothes. So, she could change between outfits in seconds. I will have to learn to make the clothing orbs one day. They're an advanced Magitech item, but for situations like this, they are just too useful. Dominic sighed. When we're back at the castle, go to supply and request one. They usually have a few in stock, and we have people on contract to make them as needed. You'll have enough money by the time that the war is over. Princess Alexis joked that he would. Even if he didn't spend much time directly in battle, he likely already had enough money from the rewards given after the last time they were attacked. Chapter 120. No Night Raid? Dominic didn't have high hopes for the night's sleep when he lay on the cot, but he drifted off to sleep in seconds, fast enough that even the Royal Guard was impressed with his ability to sleep anywhere. And the fact that, even while asleep, the area barrier spell that he erected didn't fail. That was unusual, but neither the guard nor the princess knew if he had a Magitech item that he was charging to keep the barrier up or if he had cast it directly. However, there weren't any impacts against the barrier, and the only thing moving outside the city was the group of infantry clearing out the bodies from the battle. Dominic was sure that he would wake up if something hit the barrier. He was usually a light sleeper, and the sound of a massive stone shattering against the invisible barrier would be loud enough to wake anyone. But he didn't wake until the sun began to shine in the window. He hadn't thought of that when he placed the cots. Princess Alexis was in the dark to his right, but the early morning sunlight was directly in his face. The guard at the door nodded at Dominic as he quietly sat up and took a canteen from his storage cube to splash his face and wake up a bit more. Any news overnight? he asked, using the Wavemates nation's military hand signals. The royal guard looked confused. Any action overnight? Dominic mouthed silently. The guard shook his hand, then motioned for Dominic to join him. What hand language is that? It's not the royal signal. The guard whispered. It's the Wavemates military sign language. I thought that it was common for soldiers everywhere, but I noticed that your unit uses a different one. The royal guard nodded. Most of the coastal nations use this one, and we had always assumed that Wavemates did as well, as it's simple and one-handed, so it can be used with a weapon. But you say that they used another among themselves? Dominic nodded. Well, I guess it's a lost art now, as the Wavemates army no longer exists. But there should be a few people out there who still know it. The door swung open a little, and the guard from outside the door leaned in. It's not completely lost. The trade guild uses it for their senior officers. They're super secretive about it, though. If they think someone saw them using it, they switch. He explained. Oh, I didn't know that it was the same sign language. Now, that is useful information. The trade guild is a pain to deal with. They say that they only negotiate with members, but when you ask how to get a membership, they just say that you would know if you were eligible. The guard inside the room muttered. Princess Alexis cleared her throat. Is gossiping about the trade guild what everyone needs to be doing right now? Dominic shrugged. We have no reports of night attacks at all, not even an attempt at the wall. That might not be good news, but until something happens, we're just standing by. Princess Alexis nodded. All right, send the maids to get us some breakfast, and we will eat before the Marquis gets up. He has stomach issues, so he only eats unseasoned food. She explained. Dominic smiled. That was an important consideration. Unseasoned food should be a war crime of some sort. The maid came in a few minutes later, and Dominic smirked at the expression on the princess' face. The meal was ordinary enough, scrambled eggs and potatoes with flatbread. But the only sign of seasoning was the butter that had been used to pan-fry the previously boiled potatoes. Dominic pulled a small vial out of his storage cube. I have kitchen pepper if you want. The princess gave him a confused look. Oh, it's a blend of spices that most people keep in their kitchen. Like a signature spice blend that gets used on any dish that doesn't need a specific flavor. There is pepper, allspice, nutmeg, cinnamon, salt, cloves, and a few other spices mixed in. Dominic explained. He shook some over his meal and passed her the shaker. Well, it's worth a shot. It doesn't sound like a super spicy blend. Dominic chuckled at her reluctant acceptance, and the royal guard winked at him before addressing the princess. It's not intended to be for spice, it's to add flavor to stews. A commoner trick because they can't afford to buy whole bags of certain spices, so the spice store blends this up in bulk, and then people alter it as they please. Chili powder and curry powder are both cheap, so they're not part of the mix. The guard explained. Dominic chuckled. You know, the royal kitchens have a jar of it as well. It's just easier to premix your spices when you want something to taste the same every time. They've actually got a half dozen that I could see the last time that I was there, all pre-mixed for different dishes. Princess Alexis smiled as she tested the belatedly seasoned food. Well, I learned something today. How the Imperial Kitchen works their culinary magic had never been a topic that interested me, and the Royal Army has dedicated cooks when we deploy. She explained. The only sounds in the room were the clanking of cutlery on plates as they finished eating, and the silence was beginning to disturb Dominic. From all that he knew, sieges should be a bloody, brutal thing, with thrown boulders, attempts to burn the city, and infiltration teams being sent to try to breach their defenses. But for some reason, the Dago's army outside of Burton was simply sitting there, waiting for something. They hadn't attacked since last night, and they hadn't done much scouting either if it hadn't been enough to warrant a report to the Royal Guards. Could they have reconsidered their strategy when the airships stopped their invasion fleet and landed them outside the walls? That didn't make sense either. Not when they had sent 1,000 vehicles to the city full of soldiers. There were more people outside the walls than inside them right now by Dominic's estimation. Yet still, nothing was happening.